The Fairmont Grand Hotel stood like a beacon of power and privilege in the heart of the city, its towering silhouette cutting into the night sky. Inside, beyond the gold-trimmed doors and marble floors, the ballroom shimmered with an opulence that was almost theatrical. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, casting prismatic light over the elegantly dressed elite. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, aged wine, and something less tangible: anticipation. This was not just any charity gala. This was an event of consequence, a place where handshakes sealed deals more powerful than contracts, and casual conversations decided the next wave of societal trends. Titans of industry, celebrities draped in designer fabrics, political figures smiling with calculated charm. Every person in the room carried an unspoken sense of self-importance. This was not a gathering of the kind-hearted. This was a showcase of influence disguised as philanthropy. And among them, seated towards the back, almost deliberately out of the spotlight, was Barron Trump. At 18 years old, he had mastered something that many in this room had not: the art of quiet observation. Tall, composed, and effortlessly poised, he didn't carry himself with the arrogance that often clung to the privileged. Instead, there was something different about him, something unreadable. He was not here to be seen. He was here to watch. His presence had not gone unnoticed. A few guests whispered as their eyes flicked toward him, some out of curiosity, others out of the need to attach some deeper meaning to his attendance. Was he here as a statement? Was this the beginning of his public emergence? Or was he just another young man forced into a world he did not choose, surrounded by people who assumed they already knew everything about him? He didn't seem to care. Barron sat with a calmness that was almost unsettling in a room full of people desperate to be noticed. He sipped at his water, not wine, not champagne, watching the social choreography unfold around him. He listened, not to the words people spoke, but to the spaces between them, the way laughter sometimes rang hollow and how smiles didn't always reach the eyes. And then, the keynote speaker took the stage. A voice that thrived on controversy. The journalist was a legend in their own right, a figure both revered and reviled in equal measure. Dressed sharply in a tailored black suit, their polished appearance matched the razor-sharp wit that had made them famous. They moved with the kind of confidence that came from years of bending narratives, of crafting headlines that could make or break careers. Tonight, they promised to be thought-provoking, to challenge perspectives, to ignite thought. The crowd leaned in, eager for the entertainment. With effortless charm, the journalists began their speech, warming up the audience with witty observations about the absurdity of high society. They joked about the traffic congestion outside the hotel, the ridiculousness of ultra-rich donors patting themselves on the back for throwing one night of charity into a year of excess. The crowd loved it. Then, slowly, the jokes turned sharper. They moved from humor to commentary, shifting their focus to politics, the media landscape, and the ever-growing divide between the powerful and the people. The laughter continued, but now it had an edge to it. And then, it happened. A single moment that would change the tone of the evening forever. The first strike. The journalists took a pause, their eyes scanning the audience with a knowing smirk. They lived for moments like this, for the tension before a well-placed punchline landed, for the power that came with holding a room's attention in the palm of their hand. And then, with a casual shrug, they said it. And of course, we can't talk about the state of the world without mentioning the man who made orange the new black. Love him or hate him, you have to admit, he's the gift that keeps on giving for people like me. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. Some chuckled openly, others hesitated, uncertain of how to react. It wasn't the first time Donald Trump had been a punchline at an event like this, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Barron didn't react. He didn't even blink. But the journalist wasn't done. The next words came so smoothly that, for a brief moment, it wasn't clear whether they had been rehearsed or if the temptation of an easy target had been too strong to resist. And let's not forget his greatest contribution, his legacy. I mean, imagine growing up in a golden tower, surrounded by marble everything, while your dad tweets about Kofefi and world affairs in the same breath. That must have been character building. This time, the laughter was different. It wasn't unanimous. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't shared by everyone in the room. Because for the first time that night, the joke didn't feel like just a joke. For the first time, the journalist wasn't mocking a public figure. They were mocking a person in the room. The weight of that realization hung in the air, thick and heavy. The guests began to shift in their seats, their smiles becoming nervous, their glances flickering toward Barron. Surely he would react now. Surely he would at least flinch. But he didn't. Understood. The shift in power. Barron Trump remained motionless. His hands rested lightly on the edge of the table. His posture remained perfectly straight, his face an unreadable mask of calm. There was no tension in his shoulders, no change in expression, no sign that he had even heard what was said. But the room had heard, and in that silence, something shifted. The journalist, sensing the hesitation in the crowd, pressed forward as if trying to salvage the moment. They chuckled, attempting to keep the mood light, but something was wrong. The laughter had thinned out. The usual energy, the confidence that came from landing a punchline, was gone. They had miscalculated. This wasn't just another political figure, another headline to be written. This was an 18-year-old sitting in the same room, experiencing the weight of a world that had already decided who he was supposed to be. And yet, Barron Trump sat there, completely unmoved. He had silenced the room without uttering a single word. And the journalists knew it. For the first time that evening, they hesitated. For the first time, they weren't in control of the narrative anymore. And that, more than anything, terrified them. The weight of the moment hung over the ballroom like a dense fog, pressing down on every guest seated beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers. What had begun as a light-hearted evening filled with laughter and polite conversation had now transformed into something else entirely. Something unexpected, something that no one in the audience had anticipated. The journalist, so accustomed to commanding the room with their sharp wit and carefully crafted words, now stood at the podium with an unfamiliar sensation creeping into their bones. Uncertainty. The joke that had once seemed so clever, so effortless, now echoed back at them with an emptiness that was both unexpected and unsettling. The room, which had been filled with the murmurs of hushed conversations and the clinking of silverware against delicate porcelain just moments before, had fallen into a kind of unnatural silence, a vacuum of sound that made even the softest movements seem deafening. People were not just listening anymore. They were watching, waiting, unsure of what would happen next, unsure of how the balance of power in the room had shifted so suddenly. The tension was not something tangible, yet it wrapped itself around every guest, constricting their ability to react freely, making them second-guess whether laughter had ever been the appropriate response to what had just been said. Barron Trump remained seated, his hands lightly resting on the tablecloth, his posture straight, composed, unwavering. If there was a storm brewing inside him, if the words that had been spoken had stirred even the faintest flicker of emotion within him, he did not allow it to surface. His expression, neither amused nor offended, remained perfectly neutral, as if he had long since learned that silence could carry more weight than words ever could. The fact that he did not react in the way the journalist had expected only deepened the growing discomfort that spread through the audience like a ripple across still water. The journalist shifted slightly behind the podium, a barely perceptible movement that would have gone unnoticed in any other setting. But here, under the heavy gaze of an audience that was no longer entirely on their side, it became significant. Their confidence, which had once radiated effortlessly, now flickered, unstable and weak. The expectation had been simple: land a joke, ignite laughter, carry the evening forward with charm and authority. But something had gone wrong. Something had shifted. Something about the stillness of the young man in the corner had altered the trajectory of the moment in a way that could not be undone. The audience members, who had initially chuckled along, began to realize the weight of what had just occurred, the implications of what had been said. It was one thing to jest about a political figure whose entire public persona thrived in the world of controversy, but it was something else entirely to turn that same level of mockery toward someone who had never spoken, never engaged in the battles waged on television screens and news headlines, someone who had simply existed under the weight of a last name that carried more than its fair share of controversy. People began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, glancing toward Barron as if waiting for some kind of cue, some indication of how they were supposed to react, some unspoken permission to either laugh or disapprove. But no such cue arrived. No such permission was granted. Barron Trump did not grant them the luxury of easy resolution, did not relieve them of the burden of their own discomfort. He simply remained there, unmoving, unshaken, and in doing so, he forced everyone else to feel the weight of their own complicit amusement. The journalist, for the first time in their long career of commanding rooms and controlling conversations, felt the ground beneath them shift. The control they had once wielded so effortlessly now seemed to slip through their fingers like grains of sand, lost to the silence that had become more powerful than any retort they could summon. They had never been on the receiving end of this kind of shift before, had never felt the weight of an audience's collective realization that perhaps, just perhaps, the joke had not been as clever as it had first seemed. A few seats away from Barron, a woman who had moments ago chuckled along now found herself staring down at the stem of her wine glass, swirling the liquid inside absent-mindedly, as if willing herself to become invisible within the tension that had consumed the evening. Across the table, a man who had initially nodded in approval of the journalist's humor now avoided eye contact, suddenly uncertain of where he stood on the spectrum of appropriate responses. People were questioning themselves, questioning their own reactions, questioning whether they had been entertained or merely caught up in the momentum of a moment that now felt like a misstep. It was a rare thing to witness a room turn against the very person who had once held its attention so completely. Yet here it was happening in real time, in slow motion, unfolding like a play where the script had suddenly changed, leaving the lead performer standing alone under the harsh glow of the stage lights with no lines left to deliver. The journalist cleared their throat, a sound that cut through the silence with an awkward sharpness, a desperate attempt to reclaim the moment, to pull the room back into their grasp before it slipped away entirely. They tried to press forward, to pivot the conversation, to redirect the energy towards safer ground, but it was too late. The weight of their own words had already settled into the fabric of the evening, had already left their mark. The laughter, once so easily summoned, had vanished entirely. The charm they had relied on to steer conversations in their favor no longer held the same power. They had underestimated the presence of the young man who had remained silent, who had responded with nothing but stillness, who had forced them to confront something they had not been prepared to face. Barron Trump, without ever speaking a single word, had taken control of the room in a way that no carefully scripted speech or witty remark ever could. His silence had become a mirror, reflecting back to the audience their own unease, their own misplaced amusement, their own realization that perhaps, just perhaps, they had allowed themselves to be led into something that had never been as harmless as they had wanted to believe. As the journalist fumbled for their next words, as they attempted to recover the momentum that had once been theirs, the audience found themselves watching not with admiration, but with something closer to pity. For the first time in their career, the journalist had been outmaneuvered not by a rival, not by a rebuttal, not by a well-crafted response, but by the absence of one. The weight of the moment settled into the air, heavy and unmoving, refusing to be brushed aside with forced humor or casual redirection. Barron Trump had done nothing but sit in silence, and yet, somehow, he had won. The audience knew it. The journalist knew it. And the most unsettling realization of all was that he had known it all along. This was no accident, no fluke, no mere stroke of luck. This was something calculated, something deliberate, something learned from years of living under scrutiny, from years of being studied, analyzed, misjudged. He had understood, before anyone else in that room, exactly how the moment would unfold. He had played the long game, and he had won it without ever having to say a word. The weight of the moment did not dissipate, nor did the tension in the room ease as the journalists struggled to regain their footing. The energy that had once fueled their confidence, the sharpness of their wit that had so often dominated conversations, now seemed dull and ineffective against the sheer power of the silence that Barron Trump had wielded without ever lifting a finger. The journalists shifted, adjusting their posture slightly, their hands tightening against the podium as if physically bracing themselves for the realization that had begun to settle like a thick fog over the audience. The guests had come expecting a polished performance, an evening of lighthearted humor wrapped in the illusion of intellectual discourse, but now they found themselves caught in a far more uncomfortable reality. They were no longer merely spectators to a well-rehearsed speech, no longer passively absorbing the words being fed to them with ease. They had become participants in something much larger than they had anticipated, something that demanded more of them than polite laughter and surface-level agreement. They had been forced to think, to feel, to sit with the weight of the discomfort that had unfolded before them. Barron Trump, still seated in the same unassuming corner of the room, had yet to move. His posture had not changed, his expression had not faltered, and yet he had seized control of the entire evening in a way that was undeniable. It was not arrogance that fueled his presence, not defiance nor hostility, but rather something far more disarming, complete and total composure. He did not need to fire back, did not need to counter the words that had been thrown in his direction with anger or defensiveness. His silence was not a retreat. It was a statement more profound than any rebuttal ever could have been. He was not playing the game that the journalist had set before him. He was showing them that he had never been playing at all. The journalist, who had spent years crafting narratives, had suddenly found themselves trapped inside one they had not written. The moment had spiraled beyond their control, had slipped through their grasp in a way that was as unsettling as it was undeniable. Their attempt at humor had turned into a lesson in restraint, a lesson in power, a lesson in what it truly meant to command a room without uttering a single word. The silence grew heavier with each passing second, stretching across the ballroom like an invisible force, pressing against the very walls of the grand space. The audience, once so eager to participate in the rhythm of well-timed laughter and easy applause, now sat stiffly in their chairs, their previous amusement now transformed into unease. Some guests glanced toward Barron, their expressions unreadable, uncertain of whether they should intervene, uncertain of whether they had just witnessed something remarkable or disastrous. The journalist exhaled, a barely perceptible breath that did little to steady their faltering confidence. Their usual methods of recovery, the quick pivot, the redirection of attention, the ability to shift the energy of a room, felt impossible in the wake of what had just unfolded. The audience was no longer simply waiting for the next line, for the next joke, for the next topic to be introduced with the effortless charm they had perfected over the years. The audience was watching them now, really watching them, and not in the way they had intended. This was no longer their stage. The realization hit them slowly at first, then all at once. The crowd was no longer looking for entertainment, no longer waiting to be guided through the conversation with the same ease they had grown accustomed to. They were searching for something else now, a justification, an explanation, an answer to the question that had begun forming in their minds the moment they had realized that the young man in the corner had refused to play along. Had they been wrong to laugh? The question settled in their bones, in the spaces between each breath, in the way the room no longer felt quite as safe as it had moments ago. The journalist, once so sure of the power they held in moments like these, now stood before them as a figure that was no longer invincible. The power had shifted, the control had slipped, and the audience had felt it. Barron Trump had not reacted with anger. He had not dismissed the remarks with forced amusement. He had not given them the easy response they had been conditioned to expect. And because of that, he had exposed something deeper. The way words carried weight, the way assumptions could be shattered, the way silence could hold more meaning than the loudest voice in the room. The journalist cleared their throat, another attempt to break the unbearable stillness that had settled over the ballroom. But it was futile. The moment had already unraveled beyond repair, had already carved itself into the memory of everyone present in a way that could not be undone. Barron's presence had not been a challenge, had not been a confrontation, had not been an attempt to prove anything to anyone. But in refusing to engage, in refusing to be rattled, he had done something far more powerful. He had revealed the truth about the room. He had revealed the truth about the joke, the laughter, the expectation that he would react in the way they had assumed he would. He had revealed the truth about why the silence now felt heavier than the words ever had. And the audience knew it. The journalist knew it. For the first time in their career, they were standing on the losing side of a moment they had created. They had spoken. They had delivered the words. They had controlled the narrative. Until they hadn't. Until the youngest person in the room had taken it away from them without even trying. And now, the audience was left with the uncomfortable realization that they had not just witnessed something extraordinary, but that they had been a part of it. The guests shifted in their seats, no longer eager to participate, no longer amused, no longer certain of what had just transpired. Something had changed in that room. Something had shifted beneath the surface, and it was not something that could be erased. Barron Trump, the young man who had been expected to shrink under the weight of public scrutiny, had done the exact opposite. He had simply let the weight of silence do what words never could. And in that silence, he had won. The energy inside the grand ballroom had not just shifted, it had transformed entirely. What had started as a night of controlled elegance and effortless entertainment had unraveled into something entirely different, something unexpected, something none of the attendees had been prepared to experience. The usual rhythm of these events, the predictable ebb and flow of laughter and polite applause, had been shattered by something far more powerful than a single joke. Silence. The journalist, once the undisputed force of the room, stood frozen in place, their polished demeanor now betraying subtle cracks that had not been there before. The realization of what had happened had begun to settle, not just within them, but within the entire audience. The power had shifted, and there was no way to reverse it. They had underestimated the strength of the person they had chosen as the night's easy target. Barron Trump had not fought back. He had not stormed out. He had not met them with anger, nor had he played into the expected cycle of outrage and rebuttal. He had done something far worse to them. He had let them see themselves. He remained in his chair, still poised, still composed, still watching with the quiet intensity of someone who understood exactly what had unfolded before him. His silence had forced the audience to reconsider their own reactions, had made them question the amusement they had so freely indulged in before realizing the consequences of it. They had laughed, and now they weren't sure why. Something unspoken had settled over the room, a discomfort that could not be ignored or brushed aside. The night was not ruined, but it was forever changed. The conversation would no longer flow in the same effortless way it had before. The energy, once filled with lighthearted ease, now carried a weight that could not be lifted. The journalist, still gripping the podium, struggled for the next move. There was no easy way out of this moment. The usual tricks, shifting the subject, redirecting attention, throwing in a self-deprecating joke to defuse the tension, would not work here. The audience had already felt the shift, had already witnessed the power dynamic of the evening change hands, and there was no going back. Barron had not simply refused to play the game. He had revealed the game for what it was. The audience, filled with some of the most powerful and influential figures in the country, found themselves caught in a rare and unfamiliar sensation: uncertainty. They had attended countless events like this before, had listened to similar speeches, had participated in the same kind of effortless amusement that coated their evenings in a comfortable detachment. But tonight was different. Tonight, they had been forced to look inward. They had expected a speech that would challenge political figures, expected commentary that would play on the cultural divides that fueled the media machine, expected to hear sharp wit at the expense of those they either admired or despised. What they had not expected was to feel implicated in their own laughter. Eyes that had once flickered with amusement now darted toward Barron, watching him not with curiosity, but with something closer to caution. He had done nothing, and yet he had changed everything. A man near the front of the room, a seasoned political strategist whose career had been built on navigating public perception, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He recognized what had just happened in a way others might not. He had seen politicians lose control of a debate, had watched carefully constructed public figures unravel under the weight of miscalculation, but never like this. This was something different. This was not a man defeated by counterarguments or exposed contradictions. This was a moment in which control had slipped through someone's fingers simply because the person they had targeted had refused to play along. And now, everyone in the room had to sit with it. The journalists took a slow, steady breath, their carefully cultivated composure barely holding together under the weight of their own misstep. They could feel the way the audience had distanced themselves, the way the previous support they had relied upon had become something more hesitant, something uncertain. The silence had become its own kind of judgment. It wasn't just about the joke anymore. It was about what the joke had exposed. As the moment stretched, something even more unsettling began to happen. A few guests, scattered throughout the room, started to murmur among themselves, their voices hushed but urgent. The journalist had made a mistake, not in the mechanics of their delivery, not in the wording of the joke, but in the underestimation of what it would mean to turn their humor towards someone who had chosen not to retaliate. What had been meant as harmless satire now carried a different weight, one that could not be excused or laughed away. The discomfort had planted itself too deeply. A man near the back, a well-known media mogul, crossed his arms as he observed the scene unfold, his lips pressed into a thin line of realization. He had seen public perception change before, had watched as narratives twisted and turned in ways that no one could have predicted. And tonight, he was witnessing the exact moment when the journalist, once untouchable, had miscalculated their own audience. For years, figures like the journalist had built their careers on the understanding that public opinion could be shaped, the humor could be used as both a weapon and a shield, that laughter was the ultimate form of social reinforcement. But tonight, laughter had turned against them. Barron Trump had done nothing. And yet, in his nothingness, he had won. Barron did not wait for the night to resolve itself. He did not need to. With the same quiet control he had maintained throughout the evening, he reached for the edge of the table, his fingers brushing against the smooth fabric of the tablecloth as he slowly rose from his chair. He did not move quickly, did not make a scene, did not acknowledge the tension that had wrapped itself around the room like an invisible chain. He simply stood, and just like that, he was done. No grand exit, no words left to linger in the air. Just the power of his presence withdrawing from the room, leaving behind the weight of everything he had refused to give. He stepped away from the table with deliberate ease, his movements fluid, unhurried, unconcerned. He had never been shaken, never been rattled, never been reduced to the level of those who had tried to make him a spectacle. And that was the most devastating response of all. The journalist watched as he moved toward the exit, watched as the attention of the audience followed him rather than remaining on the stage where they had once commanded absolute control. The shift was complete now. The moment no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the young man who had refused to be defined by it. Barron did not turn back. He did not look over his shoulder. He simply walked away, leaving behind the shattered remnants of a moment that had once belonged to someone else, but now belonged entirely to him. And the audience, caught in the realization of everything that had transpired, was left to reckon with the silence he had left in his wake. The echoes of the moment lingered long after Barron Trump had exited the ballroom, his departure leaving behind an atmosphere thick with something indescribable, something no one quite knew how to process. The guests remained seated, their conversations stifled by the weight of what they had just witnessed, their glasses untouched, their previous amusement now a distant memory. The clinking of silverware had ceased entirely, the once effortless rhythm of the evening now replaced by something far more fragile, an awareness that no one had expected to feel. For years, events like this had followed a familiar script. Powerful figures gathered under the guise of charity and camaraderie. Journalists delivered cutting commentary wrapped in humor, and laughter flowed just as freely as the champagne and crystal flutes. There had always been an understanding, an unspoken agreement that certain names, certain reputations, were fair game for mockery. But tonight, that balance had shifted in a way no one had anticipated. The journalist, still standing at the podium, no longer carried the same authority they had possessed mere minutes ago. The microphone before them had become a burden rather than a tool. Their prepared remarks, now useless in the face of the silence Barron had left behind. Their hands, once steady, now gripped the edges of the podium with a tension they could not disguise. They had lost control, and worse, they knew it. The murmurs in the crowd grew, low whispers that seemed hesitant, uncertain. The guests were not just discussing what had happened, they were questioning it. What had begun as an effortless moment of humor had unraveled into something far deeper, something that made them examine not just the joke itself, but their own response to it. They had laughed, they had participated, and now they felt the weight of it in a way they had not expected. Some guests glanced toward the empty seat where Barron had been moments ago, their expressions unreadable, their thoughts tangled in the confusion of what had just transpired. It was not just about the joke. It was about the response, or rather, the lack of one. Barron had said nothing. He had not played into the outrage, had not retaliated, had not offered the journalists the luxury of conflict. He had done the one thing that no one in that room had expected. He had let them see themselves. And now, as the realization settled deep into their bones, they felt the weight of what that meant. The journalists had always prided themselves on their ability to read a room, to shift energy at will, to command attention with nothing more than the cadence of their voice and the precision of their words. But now those tools had failed them. They had miscalculated. They had assumed that the response they expected would be the response they received. But instead, they had been left standing in the aftermath of a silence they did not know how to combat. The usual tricks, the practiced charm, the ability to deflect, it all felt empty now. The audience was still watching, but not in the way they had been before. They were not waiting for another joke, not waiting to be guided back into comfort. They were waiting to understand what had just happened. And the journalist had no answer. They cleared their throat, a sound that felt small against the enormity of what had just occurred. They could not laugh it off, could not pretend a shift had not happened, could not force the crowd back into the easy rhythm of polite amusement. The control had slipped, and everyone in the room had felt it. The only thing left was to end it. With a forced smile, they closed their notes, their voice steady but lacking its former sharpness as they thanked the audience for their time. There was no grand, closing remark, no final joke to reclaim authority, just the quiet, humbling realization that they had been undone, not by words but by the absence of them. The social media explosion. Before the final guests had even left the ballroom, the event had already begun to spread beyond the walls of the Fairmont Grand Hotel. Videos had been taken, grainy footage from carefully angled phones, clips uploaded within seconds, snippets of a moment that no one had been able to fully process in real time. The internet, however, wasted no time in dissecting every second of it. Headlines emerged within the hour. A joke that went too far? The night Barron Trump silenced a journalist without saying a word. When the room turns against you, a case study in public perception, strength in silence. How Barron Trump's composure left an audience questioning itself. The reactions were immediate and divided. Some defended the journalist. arguing that public figures should expect scrutiny, should learn to handle criticism, should accept the nature of their own notoriety. But others, even those who had no personal affinity for Barron or his family, saw something else in the footage. It was not about the joke itself. It was about the moment after. The way the laughter had stopped, the way the energy had shifted, the way Barron had refused to respond in the way he was expected to, and that, more than anything, had forced people to examine their own participation. For the first time, it was not Barron Trump who was being questioned. It was the people who had laughed. The next morning, the fallout was still unfolding. The journalists had not spoken publicly. The silence from their end was almost poetic, an unintentional echo of the very force that had unraveled them the night before. Barron, on the other hand, had not acknowledged the event at all. No statement, no reaction, no attempt to frame the narrative in his favor. He simply continued as he always had, silent, composed, unmoved, and that, in itself, became the most powerful response of all, because the world was waiting for him to react, waiting for him to acknowledge the moment that had defined the evening. But he did not need to. He had already won, and now, the only thing left was for everyone else to sit with the questions he had left behind. As the world dissected the moment, as analysts debated what it meant, as supporters and critics alike formed their own narratives, there was one lingering truth that no one could escape. Power does not always come from words. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing at all. And Barron Trump had proven that to an entire room of the most powerful people in the country.